Thank you, McKenna. All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you all for being here today. We'll go ahead and jump right in. We appreciate you all attending and participating throughout this process. If we could go to the agenda slide, please. We have a lot on our agenda today. So we're gonna kind of jump right in, and we're gonna work through a lot of things today. So we do really appreciate your time and attention and attendance and comments and everything throughout this whole process. So I think we have a really interesting meeting today. We will run through some updates on the non-per capita program, and then we have a guest presentation by Claire Madden, who will be talking about some ideas on better incorporating private water providers into that non-per capita program. So we're really looking forward to that presentation. Thank you, Claire, for being here today. And then after we have that presentation and that discussion, we'll be moving on to discussing some details of the Gpcd program. I think we have some really interesting things to share today, so we're also looking forward to that discussion. We can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Just as a quick recap, in our previous meetings kind of throughout this group, we've covered a lot of information on the non-per capita program. We, at our last meeting, talked a little bit about kind of some initial ideas for how we might restructure the Gpcd program. So we're going to talk in a lot more detail about that Gpcd program today, later in this meeting. We do have some more work to do throughout kind of the development of the fifth management plans for the municipal program. So we want to, as we're moving forward, I'll actually talk about this in a couple slides in a little bit more detail. We do have some additional discussions that we'll need to have regarding that non-per capita program, regarding kind of finalizing this Gpcd program. And we may want to have some additional discussions on an alternative conservation program. We can talk about that a little bit more later as well. We do have another meeting of this group scheduled for March 31st, so you can save the date for that on your calendars. We will, I think that's already on ADWR's public meetings calendar, and we'll obviously be sending out our usual reminders and that type of thing via email. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and we'll kind of jump right in here. So I wanted to provide quickly an update on where we are with the fourth and fifth management plans and kind of our timelines for this group and for writing those fifth management plans. So the graphic you see on your screen is a familiar one. I know a lot of you have been in these meetings since the beginning, so you've seen some version of this many times. We set up this timeline in mid-2019 to complete the remaining fourth management plans and to develop and adopt the fifth management plans. We created this management plans work group as our stakeholder forum for developing the fifth management plans, and have been working over the last year and a half to utilize ideas and input from this group, our subgroups, and that main group to develop concepts for the conservation programs in the 5 MPs. If you could go to the next slide, please. Our original intent was that we would complete the development process in this work group by the end of 2020. We're here today, it's 2021, so obviously we didn't quite reach that goal. But we do want to continue these discussions to ensure we're taking the time we need to have the discussions that are needed to move forward with those plans. We do still intend to take the bulk of this year to draft the fifth management plans. We've already begun some initial stages of that process, but we'll be sequencing that drafting process in a way that allows for some of these discussions with stakeholders in the regulated community to continue in this work group, in the subgroup meetings over the next several months. This timeline and the drafting of the plans this year allows for those plans to be adopted over the course of 2022. And that would allow those conservation programs to go into effect on January 1st, 2025. So that's the ultimate target we're reaching for here, is having those conservation programs effective on January 1st, 2025. Next slide, please. So what you see here is a little bit of a draft timeline. While we are certainly working to provide sufficient space for these discussions, we are also on a tight timeline and do need to move forward with these discussions efficiently. So you can see on this slide a potential timeline for the additional items that will need to be discussed in this group, kind of what I mentioned a few minutes ago, and how we might sequence having those discussions. So this should not be taken as a final version of this. There might need to be changes made to this schedule. And this schedule should not be taken as the end of stakeholder involvement or seen as all things need to be settled by the end of this time frame. Rather, what we're trying to do is get enough of a framework for all of the AMAs that ADWR staff can put something on paper, write something down, begin sharing initial drafts of that regulatory language. Next slide, please. The reason that we need to move ahead is that, like I said, we're on an aggressive timeline drafting those plans. We no longer have multiple AMA offices, and we will be drafting all 5 plans simultaneously, meaning that in order to dedicate enough staff time to drafting those plans, we kind of need to move into this next phase so that we can focus our time and resources on that task. The general outline and structure of the plans and programs will match across the AMAs, but we're looking for stakeholders in each AMA to consider and provide input to us on the type of customization needed for each AMA. In addition to that, we will be reconvening these work groups as kind of a phase 2 of these work groups to review the draft regulatory language as it's developed, allowing additional time for review, for discussion, for feedback, and for refinement of that language and of those concepts. So we can go ahead and pause for questions here. Maggie, if you could start the timer on that. We'll go ahead and pause for questions. You can add any questions. Either feel free to unmute yourself, or you can type your questions into the chat box.
All right, thank you, Natalie. I don't see any questions in the chat box so far.
Great, thank you, Maggie. So we'll go ahead and move to the next section, and I will hand it off to McKenna to provide a little bit of an update on our non-per capita work.
Awesome, thank you, Natalie. So I will be providing an update on the 5MP non-per capita conservation program revisions. So we have incorporated a lot of stakeholder input into the 5MP non-per capita conservation program BMP list, which is located in Appendix 5C. We are continually updating this list as we receive feedback and posting the most recent version on our 5MP concepts page. We are still working through developing some of the details of the planning category BMPs, but you can see their most recent draft version in the Appendix 5C. There is also a document that shows the overview of proposed changes, which outlines the changes between the 4MP and 5MP, as well as the changes from the first draft of the Appendix 5C to the most recent draft. Please review the draft Appendix 5C and submit any comments or questions you have to the management plans team. I have provided a link to Appendix 5C and the overview of proposed changes on this slide, but you can also access these via the 5MP concepts page. We have also received a proposal for an integrated conservation program that could be incorporated within the non-per capita conservation program. And we have a guest presentation today to go over the details of this proposal. I am excited to introduce Claire Madden, who will be presenting this proposal. Claire Madden is a research associate at Westwater Research. Thank you for presenting today, Claire, and I'll hand it off to you now.
Great, thanks, McKenna. Again, my name is Claire Madden, and I'm a research associate with Westwater Research. We're an economic consulting firm that specializes in water resources, and I'm really excited to join the municipal subgroup meeting today to present a proposal for an integrated conservation program. We're proposing this for inclusion in the municipal chapter of the fifth management plans, with the idea that it might help to increase the continuity and conservation program implementation between municipalities and private water companies. I've been working with Terry Sue Rossi, who's the water resources manager at Arizona Water Company, for several months to design water conservation and demand management programs for Arizona Water Company's service areas. And it's through this work that, and the practical application of the management plan municipal conservation requirements, that we came to the idea and the proposal that we're going to be presenting today. Next slide, please. To provide some context for what we'll be presenting today, I'm going to start by introducing a few key conditions that led to the formation of this proposal, and then describe the issue that we hope to address. And next, I'll review the types of programs within each of the BMP categories that this proposal may help with, and then go through a brief case study, and finally describe the specifics of our proposal. And I believe we'll have a little bit of time at the end of the presentation for questions and feedback from the group. Next slide, please. Throughout Arizona, many communities rely on private water companies to provide drinking water service, as not all municipalities have the capacity to operate a water utility. By our count, there are 38 private water systems within Arizona's active management areas that are regulated as large municipal providers under the management plans. And large municipal providers are those that deliver more than 250 acre-feet of non-irrigation water per year. And there are many more private water companies that operate as small municipal providers, but for the purposes of this proposal, we'll be focusing on the conservation requirements for those large municipal providers. Most of these private water companies that are large municipal providers are regulated under the non-per capita conservation program during the fourth management plan implementation period. And also, unlike public water utilities, private water companies are regulated by the Arizona Corporation Commission in addition to Arizona Department of Water Resources. Next slide, please. We have identified some pretty substantial differences in the ability of private water companies and public water utilities to implement the conservation programs and best management practices that are required under the fourth management plans. Specifically, not all BMPs included in the fourth management plan were well suited to implementation by a private water company. And this is really because public water utilities have the ability to implement water conservation programs as a function of government, which allows for continuity between water conservation measures and other aspects of municipal governments like city code, zoning code, ordinances, and city planning. On the other hand, private water companies have a limited ability and sometimes a limited incentive to work in cohesion with other aspects of city governance to implement BMPs and conservation programs that align with city policies and result in real water conservation outcomes. In the current version of the management plans, there's little opportunity for regulated private water companies to receive recognition for conservation measures that were implemented by a municipal government. And there's no formalized system to incentivize collaboration between private water companies and the municipal governments in the areas that they serve. To better illustrate this point, I'm going to go through each of the BMP categories as they were in the fourth management plan and provide an example or two of what aspects of the BMPs are well suited to implementation by a private water company versus a municipal government, and how collaboration between these entities can increase overall program efficacy and conservation outcomes. Next slide, please. This table shows all of the BMP categories that were in the fourth management plans and provides a few examples of the types of BMPs under each category. But there's a lot here, so I'd like to go through each of these categories one by one. Next slide, please. So beginning with category 1, which is public awareness and education. This category includes measures like community events, conservation messaging campaigns, and market surveys. And for this category, a private water company has the ability to develop the technical information and materials necessary to implement these programs. However, the value that a city government can provide is integrating these efforts into existing community events, communications, and messaging. In addition, there's a lot of value to implementing these types of programs through a trusted community leader, like a city council member or perhaps the mayor, that the community has an established relationship with, as compared to a representative from a private water company who may not have been able to develop the same level of community rapport. Next slide, please. The next category is education and training. And again, in this category, we see that private water companies are absolutely well suited to developing water conservation education materials and content, and providing technical support to establish and implement these types of events. However, a municipal government can play a role by integrating these programs into existing adult and youth education programs that are often offered by a city. And in addition, a city can facilitate coordination with local school districts to implement water conservation education programming in schools for both students and staff. Next slide, please. For category 3, which is outreach services, private water companies, again, are well suited to implementing the technical components of these programs, including tracking customer water use, providing customer notices of high water use, and similar activities. Where a municipality can help increase the efficacy of these programs is through advertisement and public awareness, maybe in the form of integrating a water conservation ethic into a broader city branding and marketing campaign, or providing residents with information on the availability of these types of programs that may have a broader reach than a private water company would be able to achieve on their own. Next slide, please. Category 4 is physical system evaluations and improvement, and this is really a category that is well suited to the water provider. So private water companies often have existing operations, or at least the responsibility to address these types of management actions. However, a city government can help to improve the implementation of these programs through cost-sharing agreements and by testifying in support of filings made by private water companies to the Arizona Corporation Commission to support increased funding that will help to address system improvements and reduce lost and unaccounted for water. Next slide, please. Many of the BMPs in category 5 could be greatly improved through collaboration between a private water companies and the municipal governments. In particular, a municipal government is the authority that can write ordinances such as landscape requirements, plumbing code, and water efficiency metrics into city code and zoning code. And often private water companies have little authority to do this, to take these actions. So municipalities also have an established system of monitoring and enforcement for code violations and the like. And this is a really crucial component to ensuring that implementation of these BMPs results in actual water savings. In this category in particular, we think that the extent to which the implementation of these BMPs results in actual water savings would be really increased through collaboration with the municipal government. Next slide, please. Category 6, rebates and incentives. These are a really effective system of achieving water savings. However, private water companies have little incentive to implement these BMPs. Because private water companies have to demonstrate an increase in costs to the Arizona Corporation Commission in order to justify rate increases, a program like this must be in place before a private water company would be able to begin recovering costs associated with the implementation. So this presents a pretty substantial disincentive. However, a municipal government collaborating with a private water company may be in a position to provide seed funds to establish the program, say during the first year, and this would provide sufficient incentive to begin rebate or program, and then could provide support for going through the rate adjustment process if necessary in order to recoup the costs of continuing a program like this. Next slide, please. The last category is research and innovation programs, and these BMPs can be implemented by a private water company, but we think they might have more reach and impact if they're implemented collaboratively with the municipal government. By leveraging the relationships of both the private water company and the municipal government, these programs may be able to achieve a more diverse set of regional partnerships. And in addition, we see a great opportunity here for pilot programs for new technology to be implemented either on city property or on, in a place where the city may be able to support increased public awareness and education for these types of trial programs. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, this proposal came out of work that Arizona Water Company is doing to implement demand management programs in their service areas. In particular, the work that Arizona Water Company has been doing in collaboration with the city of Casa Grande provides a great example of some of the conservation outcomes that can be reached through collaborative partnerships. The city of Casa Grande and Arizona Water Company have jointly implemented the Save It Casa Grande public messaging and marketing campaign, which focuses on making water conservation an integral part of the community ethic and lifestyle, and is one component of a larger citywide branding and marketing campaign. Arizona Water Company and the city are in the process of rolling out a program called Water Wise Outside, which is a targeted conservation program focused on reducing outdoor water use among customers. And the pilot program for this effort will be implemented in city parks and provide an opportunity for, again, some increased public awareness and education. Lastly, Casa Grande has partnered with Arizona Water Company on several city planning efforts to ensure water use and water conservation fit within the broader growth and development goals and guidelines of the city. This includes the most recent version of the city's general plan, which identifies water availability and conservation as a key component to responsible growth. And these are just a few examples of the programs that Arizona Water Company and the city of Casa Grande have worked collaboratively to implement that have progressed water conservation in the area and may provide sort of a support for a formalized recognition of similar partnerships across Arizona that can incentivize improved conservation outcomes. Next slide, please. So now we get to the proposal. To address some of the issues that I've brought up in the last few minutes, we're proposing the development of what we're calling an integrated conservation program that could be written into the municipal chapter of the 5th management plans. The program will be an optional subset of the non-per capita conservation program that private water companies can elect to enroll in partnership with the municipal government in their service area. And this would require new provisions, including some sort of formalized recognition of these public-private partnerships working collaboratively towards water conservation requirements, but will enable private water companies to work more fluidly with the municipalities they serve towards improved water conservation outcomes. We have identified several possible requirements that may be appropriate under this program, including details on eligibility and enrollment, BMP requirements, and changes to reporting. Next slide, please. We see these additional requirements that may be necessary to make this program work falling into 4 main categories, which are up on the screen now, and I'll go through each of those in a little bit more detail in a minute. I want to point out here that we've tried to present several optional paths for designing specific requirements, but that not all of the options that we've listed in the following slides are necessarily suggested to be implemented together. We're kind of proposing this as a laundry list of options that we will defer to Department of Water Resources on the specific design and requirements that seem most appropriate in order to establish an effective program. But going through each of these kind of categories of requirements, next slide, please. Beginning with formalization of the partnership, we want to ensure that participating entities have a memorandum of understanding or some similar documentation that outlines roles and responsibilities, as well as a partnership term, which will allow for assessment and revision of the partnership at a specified date to make sure that it's really functioning as it's intended. And it may be appropriate for providers to indicate this partnership on the required provider profile, and providers will likely need there will likely need to be an established system of verification to ensure that the collaborative partnerships here are really effective. And this could be any number of things from requiring reporting on the number of joint meetings held between a private water company representative and the city, the topics covered in those meetings, the programs implemented, and the level of involvement of each entity, things like that. And it may be helpful to identify a staff member liaison that is tasked with specifically coordinating this partnership and ensuring that it's functioning. Next slide, please. We see several possible options on how to address BMP requirements. One option is that BMP requirements could remain unchanged from what is currently in the non-per capita conservation program requirements. Or it may be appropriate to have different BMP requirements for providers that opt to enroll in the integrated conservation program. We see it as an option that enrollment in this integrated conservation program could qualify for BMP points, or that additional BMP's points are required given that increased implementation capacity of the partnership. Lastly, we think it would be worth investigating the possibility that municipalities can earn BMP points separate from a private water company and then transfer those points to the company for the purpose of meeting regulation requirements, or that perhaps private water companies that serve more than one service area could implement BMPs in the areas that have the most water conservation potential and transfer some BMP points to other service areas where implementation of BMPs may be less effective. And this one in particular we think is important because it has the potential to concentrate water conservation activity in areas that have the most water savings progress to make, while providing some regulatory flexibility and allowing private water companies to meet their regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. We imagine that there's going to be some changes to reporting requirements for entities that are enrolled in the integrated conservation program. This may include a specific section of the required conservation effort report to identify programs implemented in collaboration. It may require reporting on program funding received by a municipality, or specific requirements related to tracking and reporting the program effectiveness and outcomes. Next slide, please. And lastly, we hope to see some acknowledgement and coordination with the Arizona Corporation Commission, because private water companies really have a higher regulatory burden being regulated by both Arizona Department of Water Resources and the Arizona Corporation Commission. This section focuses on how Arizona Department of Water Resources may be able to help support regulatory compliance of private water providers by increasing interagency coordination and streamlining reporting requirements. So one idea is that Arizona Department of Water Resources may be able to continue to work with Arizona Corporation Commission, the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, and other regulatory bodies to design a more universal reporting system that both public and private water company providers can use and sort of have a streamlined and harmonized approach to reporting and regulating. Next slide, please. To summarize, we see an opportunity to increase the efficacy of municipal water conservation by establishing an integrated conservation program that will incentivize collaboration and coordination between private water companies and the municipalities they serve. There are a lot of options for how the specifics of this program may be designed and written into the fifth management plans. And that will likely be in the hands of Arizona Department of Water Resources and incorporate any stakeholder feedback to decide what is appropriate in terms of the specific design of this program. But we see the integrated conservation program as an important opportunity to increase the effectiveness of municipal non-per capita conservation program and expand water conservation outcomes in the AMAs. Next slide, please. I want to thank you all for the time today and the opportunity to present this proposal. And I believe we have a few minutes for questions and feedback if anyone has anything.
Thank you so much, Claire. I think I'm just going to give it a few seconds here to see if anybody has any questions that they want to type into the chat box. All right, we have a question here from Brian Draper. He's commented, how does Claire anticipate getting around the gift clause in state statute that prohibits providing monetary support to private entities?
Thanks, Brian. That's a great question. I am not familiar with the specifics of that statute and how there may be a workaround possible. I wonder if Terry Sue might have an idea to add to address that question.
I was going to actually suggest that we ask Bill Garfield to try to answer that question because he has perhaps more experience in that than I think either you or I do, Claire. And I know that he's on the call. So Bill, would you like to take a shot at answering that question? It's a very good question.
Yes, thank you, Claire and Terry Sue, for handing the baton back to me on this question. Well, I think there's two potential answers for this. One, if the city's going to be or town is going to be providing seed money to the company, it could be such that the seed money is in advance of monies that will be repaid by the utility once it has a cost recovery approved by the Corporation Commission. Secondly, I would argue that anything that the city expends, it doesn't benefit the utility directly because these programs are intended to benefit the public. That is ultimately the beneficiary of any conservation program is the public. So I would argue that any monies expended do not benefit us directly, that they could be advancing a larger public policy perspective, and that is providing for incentives and encouragement to reduce water use and to improve the efficacy of our conservation program. So those are the two quick answers that I would provide.
And then I would also add to that we're currently doing some cost sharing, and in the course of doing that cost sharing, the city contracts directly with certain support services, and then we contract with other support services. So we're sort of financially supporting different parts of the program.
Okay, thank you both for that. Question here from Heather. She's commented, can you elaborate more on how it might work if municipalities could accumulate BMP points and transfer to the private water company?
Sure, thanks, Heather. So this is sort of comes down to deciding on what's the most effective system for collaboration. And I think particularly in this case, the vision was that perhaps a municipality takes on certain BMP implementation that qualifies for BMP points and would be required to submit some sort of report or indicate to the Department of Water Resources in some way what programs they have implemented. But as a municipality that does not operate their own public water utility, those BMP points that a municipality reported to ADWR would be sort of credited to the private water company's BMP totals in that service area that the municipality is within. I hope that clarifies. So that was just one that's one option. A different option would be that the private water company would be required for reporting all of the BMPs and the level of involvement that the municipality had in each of those. So there may be some BMPs that the private water company reports that were implemented entirely by the municipality, some that were implemented together, and some that were implemented solely by the private water company. And that could be kind of a different option for how to establish the reporting requirements to get the BMP points tallied.
Thank you, Claire. Question here from Kathy Chavez. She's commented, would this apply to GWIDs? They have similar issues, but not regulated by ACC.
Thanks, Kathy. We haven't considered this program applying to entities other than private municipal providers, but I wonder if Terry Sue has thoughts on the applicability of other entities.
Yeah, I would have actually responded the way you did, Claire. We've not considered the possibility of applying this to DWIDs, but that's certainly something we could consider. They're sort of somewhere in between being well, actually, I would say they're actually more like a municipality because they own their own infrastructure and they operate their own utilities. So they actually, I think, are perhaps more like a municipal utility. So I'm not sure that well, I don't know, maybe they are kind of in between. I think we should consider that as a possibility. I hadn't really given any thought. Bill, how do you feel about that?
My short answer would be, thank you, Terry Sue, is that a DWID probably operates mostly within the county and not within city boundaries. So perhaps they could have a similar arrangement with the county, probably a little more difficult because you're talking about a county-wide potentially ordinances and, zoning requirements perhaps that the city might be able to do that a county probably couldn't, at least not for a specific DWID, right? But I agree with you, Terry Sue. They probably have certain, they're probably leaning a little more towards municipal because they are a semi-quasi-governmental body versus a private water company. So, but they probably lack some of the authorities that a city or town might have. So that's probably a way to dance around the issue. But I guess they could explore it if they felt it was a reasonable approach for them to see what opportunities might exist.
And we actually have City of Casa Grande inside their general land use plan has at least one DWID that I'm aware of. And I think it would be good for us to raise this issue with them the next time we meet. We have regular meetings with them. So we'll do that and see what they think. And I think we can also reach out to Bill Collins and ask him what he thinks about it. I think that's a really good question.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to Tina Sleeper. She has commented, can you clarify how you envision transferring BMP points from one service area to another would work? Can you provide an example of a service area that is unable to implement any BMPs?
Thanks, Tina. So this idea came out of our work in our comprehensive water use assessments for each of Arizona Water Company's service areas. And the idea was less that there may be a service area that can't implement any BMPs, but there's certain areas that have a lot more water conservation potential, I'll call it. So for example, one service area that's on the smaller side has very minimal outdoor water use, has a very low gallons per capita per day. Arizona Water Company could implement BMPs there, but we feel that the actual water savings that would result from that effort may be less than another service area that has, pretty high outdoor water use relative, also a pretty high gallons per capita per day. And we think, in order to really make an impact on water savings in these AMAs, focusing conservation efforts in those areas that really have pretty high water use comparatively would result in actually more water savings than putting the resources towards implementing BMPs in a place that already is pretty conservation minded in terms of their water use.
Thank you, Claire. Wally Wilson has commented here that the Metropolitan Domestic Water Improvement District will not have any issues reporting sufficient BMPs to comply with the management plan. And no further questions or comments in the chat box. I will mention here that Amanda Long has included the AZ Water Company issue brief link in the chat box for anyone's reference. And yeah, no further questions or comments for you, Claire.
Great, thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much for that discussion, Claire and Terry Sue and Bill. We really appreciate your contributions here. I think there are certainly some things that we have to consider in how some of their suggestions might be incorporated into the non-per capita program. There might be some really interesting improvements to be made here. So we'll certainly be following up with Terry Sue and Claire and Bill, if Bill would like to be involved with that. And we'll certainly be providing additional updates in future municipal meetings. So thank you for that. We will go ahead and move on to our next section here because we do have more information to cover in this meeting today. So I know there's a lot of content here, but we think that these are really important and good conversations to have. So thank you all for your questions and comments so far. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our GPCD discussion. If we could go to the next slide, please. I wanted to start this section by talking a little bit about kind of our needs and our goals for the 5MP GPCD program. We at ADWR, we do see the importance and the value in having a fully quantitative program under the municipal conservation programs. So if you think about the non-per capita program kind of being a fully qualitative program with a certain number of BMPs that a provider has to achieve, the GPCD program is a fully quantitative program, has historically been a fully quantitative program with just a volumetric target that needs to be reached. We see the value in that. We think there might be space for a hybrid or blend with some overlap between the two programs under the alternative conservation program. That structure does already exist, but we can come back to that in a later meeting if needed. So we did recognize from the experience of the third management plan and the fourth management plan the need for targets to be realistic and responsive to changes in the service area over time. We also recognize in the structure for the GPCD program that it has to achieve conservation. This has been something we've been working hard on throughout this entire process, that any conservation program here needs to achieve reductions in withdrawals of groundwater. So what we're looking for here is aggregate decreases at the AMA scale. So this is a program that is designed to reduce GPCDs over time. It might not be a good fit for providers whose total GPCD increases over time. And this is another reason why we'd want to be sure to provide multiple realistic options, those quantitative, qualitative, this range of options for providers to select for what fits best the characteristics of their service area. So we have developed a concept here that we believe can meet all of these criteria. Certainly is not a final proposal. There's a lot of details here that we can discuss and work out. But the concept at least seems to be really promising in terms of addressing the issues we've seen in previous plans where the targets weren't necessarily in line with reality, while still achieving conservation. So I'm going to go ahead and hand this off to McKenna to talk through how this idea was developed, how it could work, and what still will need to be discussed and decided. So McKenna.
Thank you, Natalie. So to refresh everyone on how the 4MP Gpcd requirement was set, there was a default value with minimum and maximum boundaries. The default was the provider's median Gpcd between the years 2000 and 2009. The minimum was calculated using a formula that included assumptions about water use per housing unit and per person, plus the 3MP non-residential component. The maximum was the provider's 3MP Gpcd requirement. The examples on this slide are from the Phoenix 4MP. We have heard feedback that these calculations are confusing and outdated. These calculations are not responsive to changes in the provider's service area or changes to their Gpcd. In some cases, these calculations resulted in unrealistic Gpcd requirements, either being much higher or lower than what the provider was actually achieving. To address all these concerns, we have looked for more straightforward calculations that would result in Gpcd requirements that are realistic, but still reduce withdrawals of groundwater. So here are some potential methods of calculating the 5MP Gpcd requirement. These examples follow the same default minimum and maximum structure of the 4MP, but with different ways to calculate each of those variables. The purpose of the minimum and maximum variables is to prevent the default from changing too much in one direction or the other. There are many ways that we could calculate the default minimum and maximum values, but to make the program more realistic and to simplify the calculation, we started with a rolling average methodology. I will be showing a dashboard shortly that illustrates how some of these examples play out. But before we get into the dashboard, I wanted to show you some of the ways we calculated each variable. The minimum and default variables are some combination of a rolling average of Gpcd minus a number or a percentage of Gpcd. The maximum value is some number of years rolling average of Gpcd. We looked at various combinations of these calculation methods to see what would result in realistic Gpcd requirements that still achieved an overall reduction in withdrawals of groundwater. So I will pull up the dashboard now to walk you through some of these potential Gpcd requirement calculation methods. Okay, so from our home screen, to get to the dashboard, you can go to Programs, Management Plans Workgroup. And then from here on the right, we have all of our important information. So this is where we have our meeting information. Under the 5MP concepts page, if you click that, this is where we have all of the proposals related to the fifth management plans. So under the municipal subgroup dropdown, and then under the Gpcd dropdown, we have the dashboard located here. Below the dashboard, we have a link to an Excel sheet that contains the data that we used in the dashboard. So you could look at that as well. All right. So before I go into the details of the dashboard, I wanted to go over the layout and show you how to navigate the pages. So each page will have a button that takes you to an explanation of the dashboard. If you click on this, it takes you to the explanation page, and then you can quickly navigate back to any of the other pages by clicking one of these buttons. And you can also navigate the pages by clicking on the arrows at the bottom of the screen. So this dashboard consists of 6 potential methods for calculating the GPCD requirement under the 5th management plan. Each method is a combination of different ways to calculate the default minimum and maximum variables. These could be calculated many different ways, so we chose a spectrum of different possibilities to see what would work. At this time, we are not proposing a specific method, and once you have a chance to really dive into this data, we hope you provide feedback on what you think is a reasonable way to calculate the GPCD requirements. Each graph here shows the compliance or actual GPCD, which is the blue line, the 5MP GPCD requirement, which is the black line, and the flex account balance, which is the pink or coral colored line. The black and blue lines correspond with the y-axis on the left, and the pink line corresponds with the y-axis on the right. Method 1 is the most responsive and responds quickly to changes in GPCD. It also yields the greatest amount of total conservation. Method 6 has a slower response to changes in GPCD, which provides more time for providers to make adjustments if they see their GPCD rising. However, it also results in the lowest total conservation among the 6 methods. The rest of the methods fall between 1 and 6 in level of responsiveness and total amount of conservation. Although these methods range in the level of conservation they produce, we made sure that all 6 methods would result in greater conservation than the 4MP requirements, which I will discuss on a different page of this dashboard. So to see how these scenarios or these methods would play out, we created 5 different generic provider types to demonstrate what that would look like. So provider A has a GPCD that is constant. Since the program is designed to reduce GPCD over time, you can see that in all scenarios, provider A's flex balance is decreasing, and eventually they will go out of compliance. Provider B has a decreasing GPCD. You can see their compliance GPCD is under the requirement and their flex balance is increasing. Provider C has an increasing GPCD. Their compliance GPCD is higher than their requirement and their flex balance is decreasing, causing them to eventually go out of compliance. Provider D shows an example of a provider who has a decreasing GPCD but gets a new large non-residential user, which would temporarily increase their GPCD. Each scenario responds slightly different, but overall you can see that there is an increase in their GPCD requirement. However, it does go back down. Also, you can see that they start to dip into their flex balance, but it starts to recover and go back up. The responsiveness of these scenarios allow the provider time to make adjustments and get back into compliance. Provider E shows an example where the provider has a slightly decreasing GPCD, but also has two new large non-residential users come into their service area. If a provider continually has new large non-residential users coming into their service area, they won't stay in compliance, and this program is probably not suitable for their service area. So although these methods allow more flexibility than the current structure, they still have limitations to how much providers' GPCDs can increase. So I will go through the next 2 pages of the dashboard and then take questions at the end, and we can come back to any of these pages. So we then wanted to look at how these calculation methods would have played out for actual providers. If the 5MP GPCD requirements became effective, we theoretically made the 5MP GPCD requirements become effective in 2010 for these examples. So this page shows the same 6 methods from the first page, but you can see actual providers, and you can select the providers from this drop down at the top. So you can select a provider and see how each method would affect their Gpcd requirement and their flex balance. We wanted to look at real data to see if these methods would be feasible for providers and if they would result in greater conservation than the 5MP requirements. So I won't be going through individual providers during this presentation, but we encourage you all to take a look at this page and let us know if you have any questions or comments regarding the different methods. And this third page here shows the total volume of the 4MP and 5MP Gpcd requirements. So we converted the 4MP and 5MP Gpcd requirements to acre feet and then compared the total volume to demonstrate how the potential calculation methods achieve conservation at the AMA level. The blue color of the area chart represents the 4MP Gpcd requirements, and the purple color represents the theoretical 5MP Gpcd requirements. Under all methods and AMAs, the 5MP Gpcd requirements would result in greater conservation. So even if some providers have increases to their individual Gpcd requirements, there still would be greater conservation across the AMA. So here you can click on each calculation method, and you can also filter through the different AMAs. And you can see the purple color is below the blue in all instances. So the 5MP Gpcd requirement total volume would be less than the 4MP Gpcd requirement volume. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for being patient as I walk through this dashboard. I know there's a lot of information here, so we can pause for questions and I can go back and forth between the different pages wherever you have your questions.
Thank you, McKenna. We have a question here from Patrick Adams. He's commented, can you elaborate a bit on what part or variable of the calculations makes method 1 more responsive and method 6 the least responsive?
So this is what the two method calculations look like. On each page, you can see the method's default minimum and maximum calculations. So the method 1 is a 10-year rolling average minus 2 Gpcd. And then method 6 is a 3-year rolling average minus 0.25 Gpcd.
So, oh,
yeah.
sorry, McKenna. This is Natalie. So maybe another way to look at that is that it's kind of a difference in the black line. If you watch the black line on each of these charts, you can see that the black line does slightly different things in response to what the kind of green line is doing, which is the actual Gpcd achieved in any given year. So maybe it's not a totally straightforward question or answer to that question, because what we see is that different variables in each of these methods produces a slightly different result. But we have a lot of options within those variables to kind of design this program in a way that's reasonable and also achieves conservation. Those variables are going to kind of determine how responsive this is, but also how much conservation we achieve. And kind of finding a balance between those two things is going to be where we're going to need to kind of determine where we want this program to land, is how those two things are balanced, whether we're kind of leaning toward pushing further on the conservation side or pushing further on the responsiveness side.
And you can also, just to add to that, you can also see the responsiveness in the flex account balance. So like with method 1, it depletes quite faster than method 6. So method 6 provides more time to stay in compliance, whereas method 1 has less time because it is depleting faster.
Thank you, Natalie and McKenna. Patrick has a verbal question. Patrick, you're welcome to unmute yourself now.
Thank you, Maggie. And thanks for that answer. Could we go to the scenario D where they have a decreasing GPCD with one new large non-residential user? So I'm just going to kind of try to articulate what I think it's doing, and you can tell me where I'm wrong. And so it looks like the black line where you see that kind of in year 1, excuse me, the teal line spikes up, that's the GPCD. And you see the black line kind of try to follow it with that rolling average. It's a little bit lagged. So the target is responding to the increase in actual water use. It looks like on methods 4, 5, and 6 that as the actual water use in the teal spikes up and the black line goes to follow it, you can see that that flex balance dips. But the flex account never actually reaches -20. So by the time around like year 2030, they're back, that provider is back in compliance. So the teal line is below the black line in the scenarios 4, 5, and 6. And the flex balance never bottomed out at -20. So is it accurate to say that their GPCD spiked, it took a few years for that target to catch up and adjust, they dipped into their flex balance, which went negative a little bit, but they actually are never out of compliance because it never bottomed out at -20, and then around year 2030, their actual GPCD is under the target again. Is that
Right.
a fair way to characterize, at least from the 3 bottom charts?
Right. So in the example of the Phoenix AMA, a provider can accrue up to +60 in their flex account or debit up to -20 GPCD in their flex account. So you're absolutely correct there that as that provider doesn't dip below -20 in their flex account, then they are still in compliance with the program. So the design of that flexibility account and kind of the design of this responsiveness allows a provider under this type of scenario where they bumped up, but then they're kind of continuing their typical downward trajectory, they can still be in compliance with this style of a program because the design of the program, the style of the program is to see GPCDs decreasing over time. So a provider whose GPCD is generally decreasing over time can remain in compliance with this program.
So it seems like the difference between the top 3 methods is that the target adjusts a little slower. And so they might actually bottom out at that -20 in their flex account after a few years, and they would be out of compliance in the top 3, where the target takes a little bit longer to catch up to that increased GPCD.
Right, and that's kind of what we were talking about of trying to kind of find that balance of not too much fluctuation in the requirement, but also enough responsiveness, enough flexibility to make this kind of a reasonable, workable program.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay, and moving forward, I don't see any additional questions or comments in the chat box. I will, however, mention that Amanda Long has again included the link to the dashboard in the chat box for us. But again, you can also find this dashboard available on the ADWR 5MP Concepts webpage for your reference in the future. And that's it in the chat box.
I would want to just reiterate what Maggie just said about the concepts page. We do we work really hard to keep that concepts page up to date. So like McKenna mentioned earlier, we do have that dashboard available on the concepts page. I would very much encourage you all to click around on there and see how the different scenarios play out. I think it's really interesting to see kind of in that imaginary scenario where this went into effect in 2010, it provides a little bit of context on how this could have played out had it gone into effect back then. I think it's really interesting to kind of better understand how this type of a structure works. So we do want some additional feedback potentially on this general structure. Does this general structure of a rolling average reduced by some amount seem to work? We're interested in feedback on how we kind of establish that reasonability of balancing conservation with that responsiveness here. And kind of in that same vein, how do we go about kind of setting the variables here and establishing kind of a final proposal for this program? We will probably in future meetings also want to come back and discuss those flexibility provisions. Patrick kind of pointed this out, that each AMA has flexibility provisions under their GPCD program. And we might want to have a conversation about what those ranges are, whether those ranges are appropriate, whether those ranges might be harmonized across the AMA, because they are different across the AMAs currently. So we might want to have a conversation about that in a future meeting, and we may want to have a conversation about the types of water that are included in these calculations. Currently, this dashboard does only include the water types that are included under the fourth management plan calculations. So there might be some further discussion of what exactly is included in that calculation. I think we can go ahead and pause here. Maggie, I think we have some questions that came in.
Thank you, Natalie. Joanne Toms has commented, with these models, are there any water providers that were in the GPCD program that will need to move to the non-per capita program?
So it's a good question, Joanne, and it's a little bit tricky to say a hard yes or no on that right now, because it depends on the details on which scenario we would choose, on which method we would choose. So I think we'll be looking for feedback on the details of how we establish those parameters, those variables that McKenna talked about. It may be that some providers who were historically in the GPCD program may fit better in the non-per capita program under the 5MP. It may be that some providers who were previously in the non-per capita program will be able to comply with the GPCD program under the 5MP. So there might be some shifts like that, but it's a little hard to say for sure at this point how many might shift one way or another without having those kind of final values in place.
Thank you, Natalie. Question here from Candace. She's commented, I appreciate you loading with historic data for providers. Is there a way to use the dashboard and plug in our own future data projections? That's
a really good question. We do not currently have a way to do that. McKenna, maybe you can help me out here. I don't know of a way to do that with Power BI.
I don't think we could do it in Power BI where you could just go in and enter your own information that I'm aware of. I could look into it, but maybe we could create like a calculator in Excel or something.
Okay. And we do have an Excel spreadsheet. We do have an Excel spreadsheet that posts kind of the source data for that dashboard. So you might be able to use that Excel spreadsheet in order to do that kind of projection type analysis. Candace, if you had any questions about that spreadsheet or how that might work, or if that spreadsheet might be missing any formulas as we copied it over to the website, you can certainly reach out to us and we'd be happy to walk you through how to do that.
Patrick has commented in the chat box a suggestion for Candace in the group. Maybe you can add future data/years to the spreadsheet that they posted. She's commented, great, thank you. And there's no additional questions or comments in the chat box.
Great. Okay. McKenna, I think this is still you.
Thank you. So we just want to thank you all for your input today. We really appreciate everyone engaging in these meetings, and we know it's a lot to process. So we hope that you take the time to look through all of the material that we covered today and reach out to us with further comments or questions. You can do that at any time, fill out the questionnaire, or just be prepared to discuss anything at our next meeting. Like Natalie mentioned, our next meeting, we will continue the discussion of the non-per capita and GPCD program revisions. ADWR is also leaning towards updating the alternative conservation program, which would include residential GPCD requirements and non-residential BMP requirements. In our next meeting, we would like to hear any input you have about how to move forward with those updates. And just to reiterate again, our next meeting is March 31st at 10 a.m. We also have a turf breakout meeting in a couple weeks on February 24th, a Sayfield technical subgroup meeting on March 10th, and then an agricultural subgroup meeting on March 24th. And all of our meeting information can be found at the link that is provided on this slide. And then I'm going to hand it back to Natalie to wrap up the meeting and take any other last questions or comments.
Thank you, McKenna. Sorry, Natalie, we do have a couple of additional questions and comments here in the chat box. Brian has commented, it would appear that ADWR does not want to move away from the total GPCD program and force water providers into the non-per capita program. As the governor's office brings more large business into the Phoenix AMA, we get penalized for economic growth.
So thanks for that comment, Brian. I think what we're actually trying to do with this calculation is really the opposite of that. What we're trying to do here is make these targets more realistic and more responsive to changes in the service area over time, so that more providers may actually be able to comply with these programs over time, particularly as things change in a service area over time. We wanted to make sure for the fifth management plans, since we don't currently have a time frame on when there might be a next management plan or some other structure coming into place, we wanted to make sure that this type of program would be kind of self-updating over time and responsive to changes in a service area. And we think that this type of rolling average scenario does that really nicely. So we'd be happy to have an additional conversation with you offline, Brian, but I think the way that the program is structured, the proposal is structured, actually kind of responds to additional non-residential large businesses coming in and allows that GPCD target to respond to that over time and adjust to that over time.
Thank you, Natalie. Carol Ward has included that she has a comment. Carol, you're welcome to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Maggie. Brian, in response to your comment, I think that Natalie's explanation captures it well. The last thing that we want to do is punish economic development. And one of the things that was very apparent to us, knowing the demographics of many of the providers we work with, and knowing that the central Arizona area actually has more non-residential business and water use than the other major metropolitan areas across the Colorado River Basin. This was part of what fed into designing this structure. We know that it's not a structure that's going to work for absolutely every provider. That's the nature of being a water provider. Each one has its own unique circumstances and water use. So there is an option there. If the total GPCD doesn't even work because you do project that you're going to continuously have an increasing GPCD, it absolutely makes sense then to focus entirely on a BMP-driven program, or maybe a hybrid program, which, as Natalie mentioned, could be something that could be discussed. It has been one of the programs that we've had in the past. So we're trying to provide that spectrum to be responsive to those challenges and those unique circumstances. But I appreciate what you're saying.
Thank you, Carol. Patrick has commented in the chat box, thank you for posting the dashboards. It is a lot of information to digest. Because there is no single best GPCD target that works for every water provider, having a flexible target that is relative to each provider's characteristics seems to be a move in the right direction. Brian has commented that he would appreciate an offline discussion as well.
Thanks, Maggie. And thank you, Patrick, for that comment. We certainly recognize that the dashboard has a lot of information in it. I'm grateful for McKenna taking the time to walk through it today, but we definitely we posted that online because we definitely think it's useful for you all to take a deeper dive into that dashboard, to dig into kind of some of those examples that we have posted, to dig into the different methods and provide us additional feedback. The questionnaire is a great way to provide some additional feedback. Maybe Amanda, if you could drop that questionnaire link in the chat box again, please. We really encourage you to use that questionnaire, that especially with the amount of information that we presented in today's meeting. We know that might be a useful way to provide feedback for this particular topic. So yeah, maybe we can pause for just one more minute while to see if anyone else has any other comments. But we do really appreciate all of your time and attention today. We know this is very mathy and complicated, but we think it's a really promising direction for this program in terms of being something that's functional into the future. So we'll go ahead and pause for 1 minute here to see if anyone else has comments, to provide anyone else time to either unmute or type into the chat box.
Okay, that was about a minute. I have a comment here from Brett Fleck. He's commented, thank you to ADWR staff for your creativity in moving away from how things have been done into all the participants that provided comments. While Peoria is in the non-per capita program currently, we will evaluate whether this new program framework fits our situation going forward.
Thank you, Brett. And we certainly would appreciate any comments you might have as you do that evaluation, and would encourage other providers who are kind of in that same boat to reevaluate which program they're opting into as well. That's helpful. Thank you, Brett. I do want to just give a quick plug. I appreciate Brett's comment, thanking ADWR staff for creativity. I want to give a quick plug to my staff, McKenna in particular, for this meeting, who put so much work into developing these proposals, developing that dashboard. There's a lot of background work that goes into preparing for these meetings, so we appreciate that thanks, Brett, and I definitely appreciate the support of the staff that goes into preparing for these meetings. So seeing no more comments here, we'll go ahead and wrap up for today. Oh, I see one more thing from Carol. I'll just read it here. It says, please do take time to explore and ask questions. It's the input from all of you that drives so much of this work. Very much agreed with what Carol just said there. We definitely try to be responsive to the comments and questions that we receive from all of you, and I hope that's reflected in this proposal. So thank you so much for all of those comments that you've provided throughout this process. We look forward to continuing to develop all of this with all of you. We really appreciate all the time that you take to consider these ideas and to provide those responses. So thank you for participating. Thank you for your time and attention today. And I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you again. We'll see you soon.